us. So the grief we're feeling and the anxiety we're feeling and the uneasiness and the physical pain and the dis-ease, and all of that, these are omens and these are clues to a deeper investigation. And I think that's what's happening. And it doesn't mean that there won't be a sort of a coalescing, because clearly we know that suffering exists in our body and it's a terrible thing. And if it's the one reality I know for sure. And I can then extrapolate and say, well, if that's happening to my sister or my brother, that's not a good thing. And there's already a moral philosophy built in to the physiology of a human being. And yes, some of it is cultural, why we feel shame or guilt or remorse or any of these things. But yet there's also a universal set of values that may be self-directed and may be culturally contextual, but we play a role in that. And that's actually what's happening. This is, and this is why I believe in anarchism as a political philosophy. Anarchism is not anarchy. Anarchism is self-organization, creative self-organization. And it's a very similar, if not the same impulse as mysticism, because it's about gnosis and direct experience and conscious evolution and us deciding for ourselves, not necessarily as individualized atoms. That's the old Western sort of Russian notion of anarchism, but as sort of interdependent communitarian beings. And it's a very different approach. And this, the whatever we want to call what's happening, the revolution, the crisis, the great transition, the great shift, in its nature is going to be a mystical anarchist shift. Because it is about individual responsibility. It is about direct experience. It is about the sort of omens of the body and what our body is telling us and what our feelings are telling us, and what Terence McKenna called the felt immediacy of the present experience.
When you say mystic anarchist shift, I hear two things. One, in the mystic, that's at least my interpretation hearing you in this, is some kind of realization of non-separation in all this. And the anarchistic, I understand, as you said before, self-organization. There's self-determination and spontaneous self-organization. Because
but not simply at a individual unit level.
Right.
Because one of the miracles we are in right now, as you mentioned before, we are sitting on these small machines, a small group of people kind of spread over the world, these parts of this world, and we are in the spontaneous process of self-organization for dialogue right now. This is something that on that level is quite unique. There is also a realization, we have never met before, but there is a realization that we are together in something. At least I would say that we are in one way not really separate, and we could talk about it. I'm sure if we would talk enough about it, we would kind of touch it what it is. But there's a realization just by meeting in this, and we hold different perspectives also. With your background, your particular activist and political expertise that you have, and we in Germany having also different historic background to think about things, there's something emerging that maybe is also a part of the response to this crisis. And there was something particular in the beginning of what you said that stayed with me. You said the need to ask deep questions. Because maybe the function of the crisis, even the evolutionary function of the crisis, is that we cannot avoid any more big questions. To bring us in a situation where all the questions, all the answers, the superficial answers that we usually love to hang out with, maybe neoliberal answers, maybe the usual activist answers, all the different answers that we have and are happy and comfortable with don't seem to work anymore. So we have to, and that's the power of crisis, we have to dig deep.
Totally. And if the answer existed, in the market-based system, in Christianity or Islam or Buddhism, we would already have it. And that's also the beauty of being incarnated right now. is that we are at the edge of consciousness figuring it out. And what unites us really is the values we choose to feed. I really believe in some ways you could call it a Neoplatonic worldview, right? Because what Plato said is the world of the formless is in some ways more real than the world of the form. So I think of the perfect circle in my head, and every circle I see is a derivative of that initial circle, and everything that exists here was first an idea in someone's mind, or so then, okay, if we believe that, then there's the idea of the thought forms. And love and fear, for example, some would argue, are the two original thought forms, and everything we do is sort of feeding them in some way. But you even think of the idea of marriage, right? It has its own morphogenic field. Anyone who's ever bought a wedding book or got married or sort of invokes, well, you are my husband or wife and therefore you should do X, Y, or Z, is strengthening that morphogenetic field and that thought form. And in some ways, these thought forms use our bodies as hosts. This is what meme theory is all about.
Right.
And this sort of growing field of memetics, which is at this intersection of cognitive linguistics and evolutionary theory, is that these memes are using our bodies as host carriers. We don't even know on what levels we are propagating these memes. The invisible hand, has been taught to us for 200 years. And even though every aspect of traditional neoclassic economics has proven itself wrong, there is no rationality, there is no equilibrium because of entropy, et cetera, we're still taught these things. They're so deeply embedded in us. And we believe that if we're all individually selfish or take care of our own families, somehow this perfect equilibrium will be created. That's a very powerful mimetic virus. And so what's actually happening right now is, and this is the role of medicine. I really believe that what the plants are helping us do, and yoga and meditation and tantra and Sufism and Taoism and all of the sort of pathless paths, they allow us to re-examine the thought forms that we're holding, that we're carriers of the ideas, and allow us to re-examine our values. Because in the end, what really unites us is our values. And that's a first principle choice we have to make collectively. What are the sort of societal values we want to build for? And if we decide that they're inclusion and empathy and altruism and generosity and interdependence, then our species has a chance. And if we continue to feed the current neoliberal set of values, which is consumption and materialism and short-termism and greed and all the life-denying tendencies of the capitalist market-based system, then at best we have 20 years left of this way of living.
Right. No, I appreciate what you're saying, and I'm getting a kind of image of that what we are is far more open than we think. That when you think, it's like, is what the cosmos is a kind of contest, if you will, between these different forces. And I mean, I know for myself in deep spiritual work, you confront these forces within yourself. It's different, and they're not simply individuated forces. They're not just in me. They're part of a fabric of something that's going on here. and that you brought back in ideas as memes, as living sort of generating things, because I think often at this point, and we tend to not to kind of push the life of the mind out of the picture, trying to go back to nature, et cetera, and not realize, which I think relates to something you said much earlier, that evolution isn't happening out there. We are, this whole planet, this whole planet has given birth to us. It and the livingness of this planet have created us as the forms we are, and with the capacities we have, and are leaning into all of our capacities. Yes, our capacity to sense grief, our capacity to resonate with a traumatized planet, to resonate with, to have empathy with our fellow human beings, different species. All of that is what this sensorium is for, and yet the mind in this is very powerful, in that it helps us make our way with it. To find our way forward, or not even I don't even mean forward like we're progressing, but it allows us to gauge as this edge of life itself.
Totally. And it's interesting, right? If you look at a lot of spiritual traditions, the aim is to get to the state of no mind, and in many ways that's been interpreted as like an amputation of the mind. Yet there's a reason we have a mind, and there's a reason we have an ego, and the aim is actually to sort of recalibrate the mind and the ego to be in service of the heart and our higher selves and the broader collective transformation, not to amputate it. Because as soon as you believe that there is no ideology or ideas, you're part of somebody else's ideology and ideas. So that the deep reflection and contemplation we do in the spiritual realms, it's as equally important to do that in the realms of the mind, because these thought forms are taking hold of our bodies in all sorts of ways, and it's impossible not to, right? As a feeling, sensing being, we're at every moment engaging with all sorts of emotions and feelings and thoughts and ideas that we are cultivating like seeds, and they live within us. And when we get to the deep patterns of sort of why we're allowing them to live in us, you start the process of pruning. And I really, in my political work, I really feel that for me, and it'll be different paths for different people, but the sort of political work is the spiritual work, and it's a thing I talk to a lot of activists about. It's that the 1% doesn't exist out there. There's a 1% in all of us. There's a part of us that wants to have power and fame and wealth and ownership and all of those things. And we have to also address that. Now, I don't believe sacred activism or whatever we want to call that work on its own is enough. But I think it's actually the necessary precondition. So the enlightenment is not the end state. Enlightenment and the path to enlightenment is the precondition to do the integral yoga, as Sri Aurobindo called it, on this planet, in this realm, in this dimension that we have, I believe, on some level chosen to be here.
And maybe it's an unavoidable, important part of the whole work, because the way you opened up and both of you talked was as I saw it, a real shift of perspective, putting it upside down. Because when you started to talk about Plato and talking about the memes, and maybe that we are just hosting them, the perspective that's opening up is a perspective that's very different from our usual identifications. However I define my identity personally, or with my nation, or with my class background, or whatever, there's something there, there's a universal process going on that has some meme or consciousness nature that has its own way of developing, of evolving with us. And it's a very question. So what's the relationship between us and this?